but they're here, graduates at U of L.
Oh,
They were
wonderful.
students. I know when they were students. Oh, you should come to this.
Thank you.
All right. Wow. You quiet down very quickly. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Christina Milner. I'm currently the board chair for the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. I want to thank you all so much for coming out to this important event tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces and I see a lot of new faces. So thank you so much for coming. If you came as a guest of a member or just saw this on our social media platforms or on the radio and you're not yet a member but would love to be, please come and talk to one of the staff or a board member, anyone who's wearing one of these name pins, and we'd be so happy to sign you up. So thank you so much. As people are milling in and filling up the seats, I just want to remind people that we are trying to record this, so please silence your cell phones. That will help with the audio. Thank you so much. So tonight's talk, Unrest in Iran, is part of our World in Transition series. And before I go into introducing our speakers, I do want to thank all of our sponsors for this, their support for this event. So it's a long list. So I want to thank the Muhammad Ali Center, the Americana World Community Center, the Asia Institute Crane House, Bellarmine University, Catholic Charities of Louisville, the Fraser Kentucky History Museum, Kentucky Foundation for Women, Louisville Public Media, the Louisville Committee on Foreign Relations, the Louisville Metro Office for Women, the University of Louisville LGBT Center, and Roots 101 African American Museum. I just want to thank you all so much, and to begin, a round of applause for our sponsors. So tonight's topic leads into our discussion because recent events have made it undeniable that our economies, our politics, and the climate are inextricably interconnected. In a digital age, we're staying up to date and involved on international issues is more challenging than ever. World Affairs Council's series for this year, World in Transition speaker series, is a space that is trying to foster learning, connection, and exchange of ideas in our community. So tonight we tonight we focus on the shifting tides of geopolitical power and unrest in regions around the world, specifically with the ongoing unrest in Iran after protests broke out last September. So let me introduce tonight's speakers. Actually, we have one speaker, one moderator, excuse me. So tonight's speaker is Goli Ameri. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs. She served as the U.S. representative to the 60th session of the United Nations General Assembly and U.S. public delegate to the 61st session of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in Geneva. She has also served as the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Diplomacy at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent. Ms. Ameri is currently the co-founder and CEO of Start It Up, a mobile platform for upskilling entrepreneurs and solopreneurs. And I had the privilege of spending a lot of time with her today at lunch and also at the Muhammad Ali Center, so I know you're in for a real treat with her in her remarks tonight. So tonight's moderator, we're very honored to have with us Justice Angela McCormick Bisig. She was elected to the Kentucky Supreme Court in November 2022. She serves the 4th Supreme Court District, which is Jefferson County. Justice Bisig has been a member of the Kentucky Judiciary for 20 years. She has served in both district and circuit courts and as chief judge of both terms. She was voted the Judge of the Year by the Local Bar Association in 2013 and in 2020, and was named Trial Judge of the Year in 2021 by the American Board of Trial Associates. She was named the Kentucky Justice Association Judge of the Year also in 2016. Will you welcome them tonight? Thank you so much.
Can you all hear me? Great. Christina, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for taking me around today, especially to the Muhammad Ali Center, which was really an incredible treat. And yes, that's why I was actually wondering, is it better? Okay, wonderful. Also want to thank Xiao Yin and the World Affairs Council for inviting me here today and for all of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be here. I'm really very, very grateful. I think what I'd like to do is to make this talk as short as possible, so that we can have more time to have a conversation with our wonderful judge here and with the rest of you. So in September of 2022, about 4 months ago, a young 22-year-old girl from the Kurdistan province in Iran was visiting Tehran with her parents for a vacation. And as some of you may know, in Iran, women are obligated to wear the head covering, or hijab as it's called. And her hijab, unfortunately, was a little out of place, and quote unquote, the morality police, to make an example of her, arrested her, beat her on the head, sent her into a coma, and she died 2 days later. In many ways, this incident was the straw that broke the camel's back in Iran. You might be thinking, but women in Iran want to cover themselves. Isn't that their culture? Isn't that the Muslim requirement anyway? So today, maybe for the first time in the past 4 decades, people around the world are seeing Iranians for who they truly are, rather than through the lens portrayed by the Islamic regime and repeated by the media. To provide context, allow me to share a bit of history for you, and I promise you it's not going to be boring. The first Pahlavi Shah, the monarch of Iran, as part of the effort to further modernize Iran, banned the wearing of the Islamic hijab in 1930. That's almost a century ago. In the 1960s, the same time the US women's liberation movement was happening, similar to many Western countries, the desire for gender equality ignited and thrived in Iran. Our mothers, I was born in Iran, our mothers wanted more for their daughters, and so they pushed the envelope. Iran had a Minister of Women's Affairs, the second after France, the second country after France. And many archaic aspects of the Sharia law with regards to women, such as property rights, divorce laws, were rapidly changed. When I served at the US State Department, the Institute for International Education gifted me a book which showed that Iran in the 1970s had the largest number of foreign students in the United States, many of them women. I myself and many other young girls were amongst those students. Rapid change, of course, always brings some level of pushback, and history has shown that women's rights is what gets trampled on the most and the first. There were some conservative religious elements in Iran who felt that they were losing control, or even if some were not that conservative to begin with, were being impacted by the rapid changes. I remember that during the beginning phases of the 1979 revolution, while still a student in the US, I was spending the summer with my family in Iran. A distant cousin visited my parents' house, and from what I knew of him, my impression of him was that he was always very hip, very cool, and quite fashionable. In essence, a modern man, so to say. In the heat of the typical political discussions of those days, he told my mother and I, with a certain level of authority, that we should be more properly covered. My reserved, quiet mother, who had always felt sidestepped as a girl, even though she was raised in a modern family with 2 older brothers, was livid. His point, which was very much promoted by the Ayatollah Khomeini at the time, was that cover yourself as it excites men. My mom shot her famous glare at him and said, "Sounds like the problem is yours, and maybe you need to be reassessing your own personal proclivities." I can't tell you, you'll never forget that phrase. All this to say that the revolution of the Iranian woman's desire for parity did not suddenly stop because an Islamic regime came to power forcibly. In fact, if anything, that desire has now turned into a burning obsession. So let me paint a picture of you of what Iran looks like today. Iran is an educated country with 96% literacy rate, 98% for the majority of the population, which is under 25, including women. About 40% of Iranians in the workforce have some level of higher education, and there are more university graduates in Iran who are female than there are male. Baby boomers only make up 5% of the population. In addition, according to a recent polling done by the Tony Blair Institute in the UK, Iran has undergone rapid secularization in the past 4 decades, where majority of Iranians, to the tune of 73%, are secular. Even in rural areas, only 33% of people pray 5 times a day. To put all these numbers in perspective, a Gallup poll done in the United States in 2021 showed that 70% of Americans have some kind of religious affiliation. We are now 6 decades into the women's movement, and the women in Iran are wondering why they are stuck in quicksand. They are fighters because they want to have the independence to make their own choices and not have their lives dictated by others. Kind of reminds me of my own 2 grandmothers who were born in the early 1900s, and they really continue to be a representative example. One of them couldn't wait to get rid of her head covering, even before it was banned in the 1930s, and the other kept it on and reduced her outdoor comings and goings until the day she died. The point of this is that it was their choice and they exercised it. Today, removing the hijab is only a symbol of all the other rights and freedoms that women are missing in their lives in Iran. In addition to the women, young people who are connected and educated are tired of living in a society harkening back to the Middle Ages. And the general population chafes at an ailing economy riddled with corruption and spending Iran's treasure on creating regional turmoil. Iran is a country with an economy that essentially has the potential of being a G15 nation, yet 1/3 of its population lives below the poverty line. Let me now spend just a few minutes on why this Iranian movement is important to the United States and to the democratic world. If I asked you all sitting in the audience today whether the Islamic government of Iran is a bad actor regionally and internationally, my bet is that the majority of you would raise your hands. The Islamic Republic is now selling drones to Russia to kill Ukrainians or freeze them to death. The US alone lost many soldiers in Iraq because of Iran's involvement. The United States had to enter the Syrian civil war because of the proxy wars that Iran and Russia were waging in that country. Iran battles Saudi Arabia through another proxy fight in Yemen. Iran has bombed a synagogue, a Jewish community center in Argentina, and denies the Holocaust. More importantly, Iran is on its way to becoming a nuclear power. And the only way to stop that is a regime change. The mullahs in Iran are students of North Korea. And they have learned that their ticket to longevity is nuclear capabilities. They will slow roll the JCPOA negotiations until the day that they are ready to flip the switch. So as you can see, it's not just the people of Iran who will benefit from the success of this grassroots uprising or revolution, as the Iranians prefer to call it. Freedom in Iran would make the country less threatening to its neighbors and the rest of the world, and mark a huge victory for the cause of women's rights globally, and represent a cessation of the rise of authoritarian regimes in the past 16 years. So you are probably asking now, what can the democratic world do? First of all, the most important reason to support a democratic movement is that democracies historically don't fight each other. Therefore, democracies can offer support and solidarity that can take on many different forms. As far as the US is concerned, one of the most significant issues I have observed in terms of US-Iran policy is its partisan nature. In many ways, I would even venture to say that the policy is not really foreign, but essentially for a domestic audience. Many call it virtue signaling. Iran policy has been more of a way for each party to win voters than ultimately do what is in the best interest of the United States. The Islamic regime has been watching and taking full advantage of our domestic squabbles and consistently pitting the Europeans and the United States against each other. Republicans and Democrats have come together on a Ukraine strategy, and Ukrainians are proving that victory over tyranny is possible with sufficient support from the democratic world. We must follow a similar policy on Iran. We must also discard the pessimistic attitude that these protests will fail or that the US should not be involved. In 2009, President Obama turned his back on the Iran protest and did not even offer moral support to the Iranian people to keep the regime accountable. Yet, just recently, he graciously admitted that that policy was a mistake. Every decade, Iranians have offered the democratic world and the United States the opportunity to be rid of the Islamic regime. They pour out onto the streets, the regime hangs, murders, and rapes its citizens, and people temporarily stay home. And each administration relinquishes its responsibilities to the next one. If this sounds familiar, in many ways, this is the story of North Korea's nuclear development, except without all the uprising. I believe truly that in the world of high stakes politics, this is the most low-risk time to deal with the Iranian regime. Russia has its hands tied with its invasion of Ukraine and its dour economic situation. The Europeans are finally taking responsibility and stepping up instead of continuing trade with Iran and letting the US attend to all of Iran's malign activities. The idea here is not kinetic action and getting the US military involved. The most important step that the United States and democratic countries can take is freezing the Islamic regime's foreign assets and choking off its source of funds. This is exactly what's been done with Russia. There's been a central bank freeze, and essentially Russia's foreign assets have been frozen as a result of crimes against humanity. With no source of funds, the Islamic regime and its Revolutionary Guard Corps are hard-pressed to create regional turmoil and internal repression. So, in conclusion, if we all take a minute and think about what's happening in Iran, we realize the incredible bravery of Iranian women. Their bravery is nourished by the fact that they are imprisoned in a system that does not allow them to flourish. They're caught in a system where a group of geriatric men with conservative and unevolved attitudes are dictating their lives. And in so many ways, women's rights are not just an Iran problem. It belongs to all of humanity. It's one very critical leg in a long journey towards full equality for women. I believe we all now have a responsibility to speak out against these injustices. My life and the life of millions of people of Iranian heritage who immigrated to the Western world, to the United States, would have been radically different if we had stayed in Iran. I found myself in the United States and learned from the way our society works and the way it's organized. I was given the opportunity to achieve the best in myself. I can't think of not wanting the exact same thing for the women and the people of Iran. Many of us, first or even second generation immigrants, feel this in our bones. In the US, we have the possibility to self-actualize, to voice differing opinions. We have the ability to leverage the legal system to fight for our rights. In Iran, Iranian people desperately want the same thing. So thank you so much to all of you for being here, for being interested in this topic, and I hope for continuing to support the Iranian protests.
Can folks see us if we sit down? Good evening. I'm Justice Angela McCormick Bisig, and I'm very honored to be here tonight, and I'm excited to maybe dive a little deeper and ask some more questions of our speaker. And then I believe we're going to open it up also to those of you who are here. It is so great to be here in Louisville, Kentucky, to a standing room only audience to hear about this topic. In my preparation for tonight, I read some articles that have been written by our guest speaker, Mahsa Amini, and one of them was that in general, United States citizens are not as well educated about Iranian culture. Few of us speak Arabic, and so diplomatically, we're always a little behind the eight ball in that the Iranian citizenry has a lot more information about Americans and American culture than we do. And I'm speaking to the choir, to the people and the faces. I know so many of you from international work here in Louisville, but you are the core of people and citizens who help to engage our entire community in the importance of these issues. And I always like to say our former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, famously said one time, there's a special place in hell for women who don't lend a helping hand to other women. And I like to be positive, so I like to say there's a special place in heaven for women who do help other women. So I want to start the questioning tonight just by asking our guest a little more about what the protests look like now on the ground. Is it people out every night? And what's the scope of the participation? Is it mostly women or men involved? I know when I watched the World Cup, I was so happy to see the World Cup players give nod to the Iranian protests during their game. So maybe just to share with us a little more about how these protests are different than the historical movement that you've described, and who's participating and in what ways.
Terrific. Can you hear me? Great. If I may just add a point to what you started out by talking, my point in that article was not the American people are not familiar with Iranian culture, because my goodness, there's 180 countries around the world. My point was that unfortunately, in Washington, oftentimes many of the people that are involved in US policymaking, maybe they have studied Iran, but certainly majority of them do not speak Farsi. Oftentimes they mix up, Iran with its Arab neighbors. In essence, a lot of Iran stuff in Washington is ideological and partisan. Yeah. And I think you're going to hear me talk about that more and more. But let's talk about what's happening in Iran, by the way. And on your comment about Qatar, I don't know if you all know or not, but there were a lot of demonstrators, Iranian demonstrators in Qatar during the football games. And unfortunately, the government of Qatar essentially arrested everybody that had a T-shirt on that said "Women, Life, Freedom" on it. And then they could not get back into the stadium until they took that T-shirt out. And so the reason for that, it just shows you the kind of influence that Iran wields around the world. Not just with its neighbors, that are all scared to death of the Iranian regime, but when I was at the UN, every time there was a human rights resolution that came up on Iran, that I would go around and try to get people to vote for this resolution, their number one topic was always, well, we have this trade thing going on where we're kind of worried about them because, they're kind of unpredictable in terms of their, regional turmoil and violence. It's incredible how this regime has entrenched itself, not just domestically, but internationally in the last 4 decades. So back to your question on what makes these protests different. I think first and foremost, because this is the first women-led revolution in the world. I mean, I really think it's important for us to take a moment and internalize that. In fact, I was looking that up, and certainly the French women had a lot to do with the French Revolution, and the March on Versailles was actually their doing. But this is essentially the first women-led revolution. In addition, it's so many of the young people. It's the young people that are out there. It's not the older generation. And the young people are out there because they have no out. They have no exit. They are young. They want to be young. They're dynamic. They want to lead their lives, and they can't. And they are at a point in life where they feel like they don't really have much else to lose. It's also not just a revolution of the well-to-do. It's a revolution of everybody. And everybody means rich and poor, but it also means a variety of different ethnicities. Iran is a land of different ethnicities. You have Kurds, you have Baluchis, you have Persians, you have Kurds, you have Turks, and they've harmoniously, to a large extent, lived together for centuries. And this time, they're all together in this revolution.
And so your question leads me right into the next. Who has emerged as the leaders, the leadership circle of this protest? Who are the faces, or who are the people, and what is their background?
So, I actually am often asked that question. And in my opinion, in fact, based on history, it is not really necessary to have one leader. And I always say, my goodness, the most successful revolution in the world was the American Revolution. And the American Revolution did not just have one leader. You had Washington, you had Hamilton, you had Benjamin Franklin, you had Jackson, there was so many different people, thought leaders, that came together and pushed this revolution forward. I think there's a gentleman in the audience that I saw at lunch today, which actually said something really interesting. Many of the potential Iranian leaders are in Evin prison in Iran. Once the door of that prison is open, there's a lot of leadership that are waiting to take over things. And I think the other thing that is really important to know is that Iran has a very strong election infrastructure. We may not have liked the result of the elections, but the infrastructure is in place. We're not talking about a country like Iraq, for example, or Afghanistan that have not had a history of elections. Iran has had decades of a history of elections. Once again, we haven't liked the results, but the infrastructure is there. The voting is there. People vote. They know how to do it. There's a booth. There's a counting system. There's a whole system in place.
So I'm interested in what is happening in terms of crackdowns on the protesters by the government, and specifically, a key part of democracy that I work in, my branch of government, is having those three independent branches of government and having a court system that can serve as a check and balance. And I'm wondering, without that structure in place, how harsh are the crackdowns? Does the court system in Iran pretty much work lockstep with the government in their initiatives? Is there any independence where maybe there's a violation of the law, but that the court system has a right to treat those folks differently within the court system? So what are you seeing in terms of crackdowns by the government, and is that broad-based in the government, or are there any factions of resistance, potentially within the judges, which, when I visited Poland and their court system, the law and order party that went into place was trying to push much that happened in if everybody's familiar with the case of Marbury versus Madison, when our democracy in the United States went into place, there was a push by one administration to pack the courts with their believers. And that was the first case of judicial review here in this country. In Poland, when the Soviet Union had left control of that country, the law and order regime was again trying to pack the courts with their individuals. So I just am curious because I don't know what's the interplay between the government and the court system, and is there any independence in how the protesters and the crackdown are being treated?
Right. I think actually the definite and flat answer to that question is that no, there is not.
Okay.
I must say that I'm not by no means an expert on Iranian law, but I think one of the things that we have all seen is that, first of all, the justice system is, honestly, for lack of a better word, it's kind of a joke. It's kind of this make-believe system that the Iranian Islamic regime has set up. There are judges there, and it's not very clear whether they have any authority to be judges or not. Okay. You know, oftentimes it's some sort of a version of the Sharia law that they think they're implementing. And I probably should stop there, but I think the categorical answer is that the legal system in Iran is not a correct legal system. In fact, many of the people that have been put on trial just in the last 4 months, they haven't been even allowed to have attorneys. You know, they've even imprisoned a couple of the attorneys. So, yeah.
Okay, all right. What issues do you believe are the main goals of the protesters? You talked about the hijab, talked about women's rights, and do you see a forum happening where there's a beginning or a start to some discussion about how the protesters may have some goals met, or is that not happening yet?
So that's an excellent question, and thank you for asking that question because I really need to highlight that. You asked me how are these protests different? I would say the number one reason why this protest is different is that the people are asking for this regime to go. And before, for a number of reasons, which I can get into, there were other requests that they had.
Okay.
But this is the first time that the people of Iran no longer want an Islamic republic. You know, in 2009, for example, they came out on the streets because they thought that the elections were not legal. They were not correct. That's why they came out on the streets. In 2019, they came out on the streets because of a major hike in gas prices. This is the time where they've come out on the street and saying enough is enough.
Okay. And I was not, that really changes for all of us the role of what we can do as American citizens interested in our international world. What specific things do you think we can do, since there's not going to be a negotiated, this is going to be a game changer in Iran, it continues at this level, what can we do specifically?
You know, I think as I mentioned, first and foremost, you know, Iran policy has to become a foreign policy, not a domestic policy. So what is it that citizens can do about this? You know, I think it's very important for members of Congress and the administration to see that, you know, their constituents are actually interested in this topic, and they're interested in this topic not just because of the people of Iran, but because of it's in the national interest of the United States. And I think we all know how important it is to connect with our members of Congress, to voice our opinions, to call the White House, you know, to ask the member of Congress to speak to the administration. I actually think the Biden administration has really been trying hard to voice solidarity with the people of Iran. But we are now at a point where we are past solidarity. And you know, what happened is that for 4 months, the protesters have been out on the street. Just a few days ago, you know, every 40 days in the Muslim tradition, when somebody dies, people come out and sort of, you know, it's kind of a reminder of the person. So it was the 40th day of the death of one of the latest people that the regime has killed, and forgive me for not remembering that name. And so, you know, there was like thousands of people in the southern part of Iran. But I must say that the level of the protest has dwindled. And it's very obvious why it has dwindled. It's because they've hung two people from a crane in public. Young girls have been raped in prison. And then, of course, how many eyes have been blinded by these special pellet guns that they have imported from China? And it goes on and on. You know, there gets to a point where people think, do I go out or do I not go out? But I think the key here is that, once again, as I said in my starting talk, is that the tooth is decayed. The pain comes and goes, but the tooth is decayed. And I think every administration keeps passing the ball on to the next one. This is an opportunity the Iranian people are offering the United States and the Western world. We need to step up, not just for the Iranian people, but it's in the interests of the United States.
Okay. Why don't we open up the floor, Shoyan, to individuals here who may have questions for Ms. Ameri? I don't know if we have a microphone or if I can.
Thank you for your interest, or what you do for this topic. I have a particular interest in this because my son-in-law is a conservative Muslim. He gives seminars sometimes in Iran, sometimes in other countries, and he goes back almost, I would say, frequently and visits his family in Iran. And my grandson just came back from a 3-month in Esfahan, learning more Farsi than he already knew. But what I would like to know is what do you think the odds are that this protest is going to have any success at all?
Well, I think the protests will have success if the democratic world steps up. I mean, I think that is, ultimately, that's the bottom line. Because, as I said, the Iranian people have come out. They have protested. Their number one demand is for this regime to go. And they need somebody to have their back. They need somebody to keep the Islamic regime accountable. And what are the organizations or the governments that can keep the Islamic regime accountable? It is the democratic countries. It should be the United Nations, right? I must say the UN this time around, at least UN members stepped up because they voted to throw Iran off the Commission on the Status of Women, just to, you know, for you to have an idea of what the UN makeup looks like. Iran actually manages to get on this Commission on the Status of Women. And they voted on having a mechanism to look into the human rights violations of Iran, which, again, it's a big deal for the UN Commission on Human Rights. But other than the UN, democratic countries need to keep this regime accountable, which means the European Parliament just voted to designate the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. And the head of the European Commission, Ms. van der Leyen, came out in support. But you have the foreign policy chief of the European Union, Joseph Borrell, that actually has come out and said, we can't really designate IRGC as a terrorist organization. The reasons, I must say, are unclear. For some reason, it appears as if European foreign policy chiefs somehow established a close relationship with the Iranian regime. I have never understood that. But it's time for Europe to step up. 12% of EU's trade is with Iran. That needs to stop. The Europeans set up this mechanism, bartering mechanism with Iran called Instex, so they could circumvent US sanctions. It's time for democratic countries to step up.
Here in the very front row.
There was a gentleman by the name of Khomeini who lived in Europe for many years because he was thrown out of Iran. He continued to fight from there and gained success. And we understand that democratic countries should do this or someone else should do that. But in my opinion, what do you think of the Iranian people who are overseas? Whether in the US, in Canada, in other countries, there are lots of them, that they form their own union outside Iran, create their own government outside Iran, become a spokesperson for Iran. Then maybe something will happen, or else what you're saying is the control with the mullahs in Iran is going to continue.
Right.
Because every time someone stands up, the head goes off. How is that going to help?
Actually, that's an excellent point that you just raised. And let me add a couple of really interesting points to that. In my time in the United States and in my time in government and being involved in politics, this is the first time that I have seen the Iranian diaspora coalesce so strongly. This is the first time that I'm seeing the diaspora speak with a unified voice. Because, Iranians who immigrated to the United States, all successful in business, in medicine, in scholarship, universities, et cetera, politics was never something they wanted to get involved in. This is the first time, at least in the US, that I'm seeing this incredible coalition coming together. More importantly, one of the main reasons why this, I don't know if I call it law, but the desire passed at the European Parliament was because of a number of members of parliament in Sweden, in Germany, in France, who are of Iranian heritage. And they are members of parliament. And they built allyship with a lot of other members of parliament in France and in the European Parliament, and they were able to pass this by the European Parliament. So you're absolutely right. The diaspora needs to speak up, and I think in many ways they've done that. In the diaspora, there are also 4 or 5 what I would call leaders that have huge social media following. They have been incredibly influential in getting the word of the Iranian people out. And I think they are in the process of unifying and coming together. So your point is very well taken. We can't just expect somebody else to pick up the load. But at the same time, I'm going to keep repeating this. Democratic countries have a tremendous amount of power, and it's time for them to leverage it.
Got a question over here in the corner.
First of all, my name is Ali. I am originally from the north part of Iraq, which we call it Kurdistan. So thank you when you mentioned in your introduction the name of Kurdistan, because many people in Iran, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Syria, they don't want to say Kurdistan. And even here in the United States, many people, they don't know where is Kurdistan. Can you imagine, I met a lady, I asked her, what is your major? She said geography. Then she asked me, where are you from? I told her I am from Kurdistan. She said, oh, Kurdistan is used to be part of Soviet Union? I said, no, ma'am, we are part of Iraq, Iran, and here's my question. My age was like 80s, don't change on my hair color, I'm still young. So when Khomeini came to the power, I was like 8 years old. And people around the world shocked how this man came to the power, and they removed the very rooted family from Iran, which was Shah Iran. And since that time, America declared that they are had enmity or they are rival with this regime. But what we've seen in the ground is totally different. In 1980, Beirut or Lebanon, it became part of Iraq. Then after that, when they removed Saddam, by the way, I'm not fond of Saddam because I'm a Kurd, I know what Saddam means. When they removed Saddam, Baghdad also became part of Iraq. So right now, 4 capitals in Arab countries, Baghdad, Beirut, Sana'a, Yemen, are all those countries are under Iran's influence or run by Iran. So my question is, even in 2019, when Iran hit one of American RQ-4 drone surveillance, we thought America will react. They didn't do anything. So my question, do you trust in America that this time they will support Iranian protest, or we will just say kind of condemnation and we will listen to some rhetoric in White House or in Fox News, and Iranian people, they will suffer for a long time with this regime?
You know, first of all, I have to say that I'm going to say this is based on my own opinion. This is not based on any internal knowledge that I have of how the Biden administration is looking at this topic. But my guess is that, first of all, President Biden is someone who actually really cares about freedom and democracy. I don't know if you all remember or not, but one of the first things that his administration did was they had a summit on democracy. That's a topic that's important to him, and I don't think that's lip service. So I think we have to keep that at the back of our minds. I think we all understand that this administration has its hands full with what's going on in the Ukraine. You know, it's a time when the Ukrainians have demonstrated that with the help of democratic countries, they can step up and take care of themselves. And my hope is that, you know, the same message gets relayed to the administration, is that the Iranians have literally come out, put their lives on the line, and they've said, if you help us, not with tanks, we're not looking for tanks, we're not looking for kinetic action, we're not looking for US intervention, military intervention, we are looking for serious solidarity. And going back to what the gentleman said, I think some of that responsibility falls on us as well, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing these talks more and more, and looking to appear on media to do this more and more. I think it's important for the American people to understand that confronting the Iranian regime is in the best interest of the American public. That's the bottom line. I mean, I think the gentleman just summarized all the bad acting that Iran does regionally, and who normally takes care of that? Or who normally pays for that? It's the United States. Because the Europeans, as I said, they are busy trading away with Iran. So it is in the best interest of the United States to focus on what's going on in Iran. And yes, maybe the protesters are not out in the street as much as they used to be at the beginning, but the tooth is decayed. You cannot fix this tooth. It needs to be extracted. If you don't extract it, in another year, it's going to create another headache for you.
Hello.
A second. Oh.
I've been watching with great interest now for 14 years. And I lived in the country nearby. You mentioned sanctions, and they can be very effective. And the IRGC, Revolutionary Guards, are now going to be sanctioned because they're designated terrorist group. Helpful, and the head of it was killed about 2 years ago. What I've also found in various countries in that region and worldwide, including Russia, is that when we sanction them, initially there's a big shock and there's a big rupture in their economy, but then they find a completely new financial ecosystem. And what we've seen between Russia and Ukraine is now all these BRICS countries, the various emerging markets countries all over the world, creating new financial alliances, dealing in local currencies, even about some of our so-called allies like India or Saudi Arabia, and I'm not casting aspersions. I would say Saudi Arabia is not a great ally, but they're working with the Mir system, which is Russia's other alternative financial system. If you look at Iran, they're doing a lot of trade. First of all, Europe is not energy independent, and that's one of the reasons we've seen what's happened with Russia. And a lot of countries like Turkey are not, but they're doing tons of trade. China, India, with oil and gas, it's incredibly powerful. Hence why the Maldives wanted to come back. So what I'm seeing is a lot of countries being taking themselves off the dollar standard, which is not going to help U.S. In fact, it shoots ourselves in the foot longer term. Is there another tool in the toolbox, aside from regime change, which you sound like you're not interested in? I think most Americans are not interested in at this time. And also, how do we, as we combat the Iranian regime, which I think we can all agree is not a positive one and by any means, the other, what I would consider very bad actors in the region, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar to a certain extent, some others, Syria, which definitely support terrorism around the world. Of course, if you look at Saudi Arabia, they're killing the Shiites, the protesters, and one can argue in some of those countries, women have even fewer rights than in Iran. Thank you.
So, first of all, thank you very much for those comments. It sounds like you're very well versed on the topic of sanctions, so please talk to me after we're done. But I'm assuming that your question is whether the sanctions have any kind of an impact because Iran finds its way around them. Is that the question?
Is there another tool in the toolbox? Because I think the United States is using it, and EU seems a little bit more serious about it since they found other energy sources.
Right.
What is the other tool? Because we can only go so
Or maybe
far.
a good way to put that is, are there other steps towards the ultimate goal, which is cutting out the bad tooth, as you've put it, other steps along the way other than total regime change? What other things could be worked towards via this movement and via potentially, as you said, because we are occupied right now with the situation in the Ukraine, are there other things that we could be assisting with ultimately towards that, or do you think, is your position the total regime change is where the efforts need to go?
I think in essence, there's a reason why the expression has sort of come into fashion when it says follow the money. We want to make a change, we have to follow the money. And you're absolutely right that some of the current sanctions on Iran, they're part of the Magnitsky Act sanctions, and it's sanctioning individuals. It's like sanctioning the top brass of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The United States has a central bank freeze on Iran, which means it says, I am going to, I've frozen Iran's foreign assets, except Iran really is not holding a lot of its foreign assets in the US, and it did have some which the Obama administration sort of returned as part of the JCPOA negotiations. What I'm suggesting is exactly what is being done to Russia. Russia has a central bank freeze. That means all of its foreign assets, and I'm not exactly sure in which countries, but certainly in most parts of Europe, certainly in the United States, their foreign assets are frozen. The Iranian regime, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has $31 billion in foreign assets. And they are mostly in Japan, South Korea, partly in Germany, in the UAE, and maybe one or two other countries. If those assets are frozen, where is the IRGC going to get its money to pay its people in country that are repressing the Iranian people? Where is it going to get its money to create mayhem and turmoil regionally? We have to follow the money. One of the things that I've heard often by the diaspora asking democratic governments to pull their ambassadors, I'm not sure that's very useful because, first of all, you're losing your eyes and ears on the ground. That's not a good idea. And even if the ambassador gets pulled, the chargé is there. So, you know, that's symbolic. I can see how symbolically that would be important. But ultimately, to make systematic change, we have to follow the money.
Thank you. Hi. I want to go back to the Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi. And I wonder, one of the things I've been monitoring the protest is when I see the lack of leadership or someone to follow. I also don't see a lot of support from men. It's mostly young women, college students, as someone who has close family in Tehran currently. And I was wondering if they were to bring back, he's willing, I mean, he's extended his hand, he's willing to cooperate or willing to help. Do you think that would give him a chance in terms of international relations? Maybe him cooperating with whatever leaders that's currently on the ground to have cut ties with the Islamic Republic? I'm just wondering because I wonder what role he could play now in this midst of chaos, since there seems to be the protests are dwindling. No one is talking as much as we were talking before. I feel like we're running out of options, and I just don't want this to die down and like 5 years again have another situation where we are right now.
You know, first of all, I don't think it's my place to say who should or can lead a movement. And honestly, I am a big believer in the fact that revolutions and protests don't just need one leader. You know, and I keep going back to the American Revolution. You just need a few good women and men to come together that are thought leaders and, you know, basically push the cart forward for the Iranian people. And you know, once again, I'm going to go back to what I said before. The Iranian people are highly educated, and there is a very strong election infrastructure in Iran. I think there's certainly, I think, a good deal of fear about the day after. What happens if this regime falls? You know, I think the quick answer to that is, could things really get any better, any worse? I mean, I think that's the first thing we have to think about. And secondly, I think some people might be worried about some kind of a civil war in Iran. I don't see that happening. And the reason why I don't see that happening is because I think probably a good number of people that are part of the Revolutionary Guards is because it's a job. They have to feed their family. It's a way for them to make a living. And if there were accommodations made to pull them to the other side, that might be a good thing. And once again, there's so many thought leaders and, you know, educated people in Iran that they can step up and take up the reins. You know, we go back to what happened in 1979. Who would have thought a clerical leader could have taken over a country of, I don't know, 35, 40 million at the time? I mean, it was so unlikely. Yet he got surrounded by a whole group of people that managed essentially to forcibly bring an Islamic Republic to power. Many of those people, by the way, are now not very happy about their position at the time. So I think we need to use our imagination more and not think about some of these items that we think are facts. Revolutions need a leader. Not really.
So we're going to have 3 more questions. I'm going to kind of go up this row right here so we can collect the first 3 and remind of everyone's time, and then let Goli speak. So.
You mentioned that the electoral infrastructure is very strong, however the judicial infrastructure perhaps may not be as up to the same level. I think with our most recent national election in 2020, we also saw the importance of the strong judicial system to uphold election results and things like that. So
when you look at regime change in Iran, or any violent rejection of election results, if they were to go through court systems to try to argue election results, how would that hold up, or would that be a challenge in the regime, in terms of ensuring fair judges are in place for that?
Right, that's really an excellent question, and honestly, I don't have the knowledge to answer that question. I think the only thing that I know is that, Iran may not have a very strong legal system at the moment, but it certainly has an incredible cadre of attorneys, and legal experts in the country, many of whom are very active in defending, the people that have been the victim of human rights abuses. But your question is very good, and I don't have that kind of knowledge for that. But I will make a note of that, because I think that really is a very good point.
I just had a quick response to that. In 2009, actually did protest
Do you want to stand up and talk so we can hear you?
sorry, I'm not going to, I just wanted to do a quick response here. That in 2009, I think, they did protest the election results, and it was not that well. Yeah. You probably can talk more about that, but the Green Movement has.
Thank you.
So if I recall correctly, in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the group of people who were instrumental in overthrowing the Pahlavi monarchy were in fact university students. And I remember as the movement went on, I thought to myself about the irony of this, that a regime that was erected in a huge part due to the contributions of university students was now threatened equally by the same group students as well. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that irony.
Actually, I think one of the things about the 1979 revolution is that the causes of it either have not been sufficiently studied or they not have been sufficiently promoted in the media. There's actually a new book that somebody told me about that has kind of looked into that. I think, I remember at that time, when you were reading the Western media about why the revolution in Iran was happening, there was this focus on Westernization. And there's a word in Farsi for that was coined by a famous author. So a lot of the foreign media thought that Iran was undergoing a revolution because it was getting too Westernized. I think one of the things that I learned when I was working at the International Red Cross is that one of the biggest issues that developing countries are facing is the in-migration of people from the countryside into the cities. And that's exactly what happened in Iran. You had what was called the White Revolution, that actually took land away from the landowners and gave it to farmers. And oftentimes they did not have the skill sets to be able to know how to deal with that effectively. And as a result, a lot of young people ended up migrating into the cities. And these people had very little money, mostly men, not a lot of entertainment activities. Oftentimes they would go to the local mosque. That was where the Ayatollah's tapes were being circulated. And when you put, I'm just giving you a very brief history. There's probably a lot more other items that I am missing. But essentially, what you had was a large group of people, not highly educated, but people that came into the city and saw the difference between the rich and the poor. And that creates societal unease. And then you have some leader that comes and says, this monarch needs to go, and I am here to help you kind of get your status, living your status of living up and increase it. that had a lot to do with what happened in 1979. Were the university students involved? Absolutely, because they're university students and they're educated. And people who are educated want freedom and they want more democracy and they want more say in the government.
Can I add just briefly to the last question about the legal system? And you had mentioned earlier when I was asking you about whether there was any independence in the judiciary in Iran. I have not been to Iran. I did go to Qatar via the World Affairs, Shoyan, and I had a special track where I went to the court system where in their criminal courts they practice Sharia law. And I know at that time, women were not allowed to be judges, women were not allowed to be prosecutors, weren't allowed to practice in the courts. And I would have characterized those courts operating under Sharia law as pretty backwards by any standard we would have. I would say conversely, though, in the area of civil law, business litigation, complex business litigation, they were very good at drawing on Western legal advice and had a fairly robust body of law for dealing with business types of disputes. And they were more open to full participation in that area. There were separate courts, so to speak. And again, that's a completely different country, but I thought there may be some similarities just because in the practice of Sharia law, there would not be, as I described, any room for an independent judiciary to look at the other branch of government and say what you're doing is contrary to some basic formation documents of our country. So I would imagine it may be similar. And that was similar to the answer that you gave.
I think you're absolutely right.
I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your insight on this topic that should concern all of us as a global citizen. And thank you so much for your time. My question is, I want to take you back to your strong proponent of sanction. In this case, I assume that you're talking targeted sanction, correct?
I'm talking.
Targeted sanction?
I'm talking a central bank freeze sanction, and that usually only happens for crimes against humanity,
So
which is,
overall state sanction.
it's just for freezing all of Iran and IRGC's foreign assets.
I see. So my interest in this topic is that I have also observed and been looking into other states that the United States, or the European Union have imposed sanctions on, say, like Burma, Venezuela, or other countries, right? Often overall state sanctions have some negative impact. Quite often the folks who are responsible for the atrocity suffer less, but the citizens at large suffer quite drastically. We can come with a few countries. Why are you so optimistic about sanction as a first approach solution to this conflict that we can say dated back to the 79?
I think your point is well taken, because I'm going to go back to what I said before. If this regime is going to go, its source of funding needs to be stopped. And that includes the majority of which is its foreign assets. Because otherwise, you can sanction individuals nonstop. And people have been doing that. The United States has been doing that. In fact, they just sanctioned a number of other people, but they also sanctioned a foundation in Iran that actually financially supports a lot of the IRGC staff. That was a good step. And the Europeans have now started some other sanctioning. Sanctioning people is important because they cannot have financial dealings outside of the country, or they can't travel where they want. But in a way, it's kind of window dressing. We need to get to the bottom of the problem. And it's all about pulling the Band-Aid off little by little, or just ripping it off. And I think ultimately, the way to deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran is to freeze its foreign assets, so they don't have the funds available to them to do what they're trying to do.
I just want to follow up. I'm from Burma, and you aware Burma has been considered the hermit kingdom to the like of North Korea, to some extent like Iran in the past.
I've been there. It's an incredible country, by the way.
Right,
Yeah.
and so the regime, like Iran, don't have much national assets compared to Iran, right? And the regime has survived international sanctions and can be isolated for international community for decades after decades. And it still control and rule the country as strong as ever, like so many other well-functioning states. We're talking about Burma, it's relatively weak state. Now Iran, we're talking about very powerful, well-established state. You see what I'm saying? Like, I'm trying to see the hope that you put into sanction. It's hard for me to see, and I just want to understand more.
It's I don't know really anything about Burma's economy, to be honest with you. But what I do know right now is Russia is suffering because its foreign assets are frozen in a big way. If a country does not have access to its foreign assets, that's a big deal, especially a country like Iran. Because, there's only so much money they keep at home. They need to be ways to invest these funds.
I think that's all the time we have for our questions. Thank you, if everyone, please, let's have a